This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Good afternoon. Today we continue. We were looking a little bit rather quickly. It was a real exodus last week. Went faster than probably we would have liked. But today we're going to cover some of the judges, the Shofetim, but we'll cover mostly the Philistines, which were a rising power on the coast of the Levant. Technically, the seacoast of Israel today. Before we do, however, I wanted to tell you an anecdotal story, true and a little surprising. In 1994, I was at the International Organization for the Study of the Old Testament, known as EOSOT, which has world congresses all over the world, mostly Europe. And this one, I may have mentioned to you a little bit in brief, just very brief words, was at the Sorbonne, University of Paris, Collège de France, and we were in the main auditorium of the Sorbonne, which some of you know is just magnificent, with the paintings of French neoclassicism around it. And every single great biblical scholar, every great archaeologist from Israel was there. And I, new PhD. And we were there for this Congress, and I was in a different session. But the topic on the floor that day, and you can imagine, you know the story when you have two rabbis, you have 12 opinions. Well, can you imagine all these biblical scholars arguing, and one would seize the microphone from the other, and it was just really rambunctious. Well, I didn't feel like I was ready for that kind of forum. I was used to quietude and so on, and reading scholarly articles. But the way these archaeologists were raging at each other, and it turned out it was on a passage in Joshua. And let's go there because it's a fascinating passage. Now, when all the Amorite kings, remember the Amorites are the same as in Hebrew, Amorim, the same, this is the Greek word Amorite from the Septuagint, and it's the same as the Akkadian and Semitic Babylonian word for Westerners, Amuru. So when all the Amorite kings, the people living in the west of the Jordan, even it's kind of redundant, Amorite means Westerners anyway. These ones west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings, Canaan is a word that means the coastlands, Canaan. Canaan in Hebrew. Along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. Then this strange passage. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the people at Gibeath Ha'alot. Can you imagine? This passage caused so much consternation among all these scholars and archaeologists. And they said, mostly the consensus was, this is nothing but a Neolithic memory, a throwback to the Stone Age. And I finally said, I've had enough. I'm going to be brave and bold. So I waved my hand. The microphone came to me, and I said, well, my PhD was in stone and stone technology and stone working on igneous stones. And I said, can I add something? I'm just a brand new PhD. I really don't have a whole lot to say, but you ought to reconsider this text. It may not be a relic from the Stone Age. It may actually be pretty sensible. And then I went on to proceed what I'm going to tell you. Now, the words used for flint knives. It doesn't really say flint, it says hard stone. The word tsur is the same root word for Tyre, that rocky island that used to be freed from the coast of Phoenicia. And then Alexander built a causeway out to it. It was impenetrable. It was basically invulnerable. No one could take it by sea. It was too rocky and hard. But this word tsur, hard rock, when it was translated into different languages, it often was translated as silicate rock, which is actually the case. Hard rock. And so you make hard rock knives. And it sounds terrible, doesn't it? Particularly because of how many people had to be circumcised at once. Notice, verse 4, now this is why he did so, why Joshua did it. All those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age had died in the wilderness on the way after leaving Egypt. All the people that came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness during the journey from Egypt had not. The Israelites had moved about in the wilderness 40 years until all the men who were of military age when they left Egypt had died, since they had not obeyed the Lord. For the Lord had sworn to them if they would not see the land, he had solemnly promised their ancestors to give us a land flowing with milk and honey. So he raised up their sons in their place, and these were the ones Joshua circumcised. They were still circumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. After the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained in the camp until they were healed. Sounds painful, yes? Well, and remember, the place was then called the Hill of Foreskins. Can you imagine? You know that story, I'm sure. But I've put the word, it's not quite transliterated there. Can you see it in the green? Okay, well, that should be a very long O with a circumflex accent over it. Charbot Surim. And that U should be with, these are two mater lectionis. These are really long vowels. Tsurim. It also should be a long U. But it's very hard to get vowels, to get makrons with symbols these days. Anyway, now, I thought this was pretty sensible myself, because when the Israelites, in the literary version of the story, left Egypt, they didn't go with a lot of weapons. They didn't go with a lot of bronze tools. And that was the metal of choice. Iron really was only just being experimented with in a few places. To get iron, you have to raise the temperature up very, very high, much higher than they had that technology for anyway. And the Israelites were not melting copper in the wilderness along the way. They didn't have the means or the technology to literally make blades in their transit. But let's think about this for a moment. When you look at different materials, you all know that it's not really just the hardness of a material that can cut you. How many of you have had bad paper cuts? Right, so you know where we're going with this. But they did not have the technology in the ancient world to put a fine edge on bronze. They could hone it to a certain point, but not perfectly well. And prior to my speaking there in Paris at the Sorbonne, at the University of Paris, I had been reading some articles about new applications in ophthalmology. This was pre-laser surgery, where they were making artificial glass and other things to do tiny surgery knives. And the article in the Journal of Ophthalmology was called Back to the Stone Age. It was interesting. This was about 1990 when I'd read that. But anyway, here you can see some contemporary blades, a little after the fact. But now, mind you, these are after archaeological conservation, so the edges aren't terribly good anyway. But even when they're made fresh, when they're made brand new, quite a few of us at the Institute of Archaeology in London did a lot of what we call reverse engineering. So we went and made all kinds of things from metals and ceramics, and we tried to understand the technologies of the ancient world. And we could get pretty decent edges on things, but I remember joking with my PhD supervisor, I wouldn't want to try to do something like a very delicate operation with one of these blades, because it could be really tricky. Now, here, that's a razor blade, probably Solingen steel, under magnification. It looks pretty good, doesn't it? 200 millimicrons. But I want to show you a few interesting images. Now here, in the area, if you consider the wilderness wanderings, and remember, what we call today the Red Sea, this wing, that whole term, Mare Erythraeum, or the Erythraea, the Red Sea was really in Hebrew Yam Suf, Reed Sea. It was very shallow. I don't want to take away from, Moses, and the idea of the supernatural here, but whatever it was, they probably crossed close to here, and you probably already know that the Suez Canal is not the only canal that went through here. You probably know that around 500 BCE, Darius connected the Red Sea with the Nile River. And he used a prior canal that had been dug in the 12th dynasty by the Egyptian king. So the area's been crossed a lot in here. And of course that canal of Darius was closer to this aspect, this road right here. But anyway, so wherever the Israelites went in wandering, and this is traditionally called Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses. You probably have been to St. Catherine's Monastery there. Some of you, yes? Anybody? Wow, I'm really admiring anyone who's done that. Don't do it now, anyway. But when you wander through this area, notice right here on Jordan, and here's the Jordan River basin, although this is called the Arabah. There's no water flowing down here from the Dead Sea. It's a geological sill. It's a raised area. It's part of the Great Rift, but it's been raised for millions of years, so the river has not flown any further down for a long time. But you come around this area of Jordan, and do you see all that dark stuff there? That's volcanic stone. That's lava, and it's also volcanic glass that we call obsidian. Now this area is very prevalent as well with flint. Flint, a microcrystalline silicate. My PhD supervisor did his PhD on dating flints using electron spin resonance. He was a physicist, so that just kind of tells you where some of the stone technology discussions could have gone. But here's the Wadi Rum Visitor Center. It's a national park in Jordan, and it is laden with flint. Here, by the way, and also the area has obsidian. That's what the Wadi Rum looks like. If you like deserts, great. A lot of this area of the Wadi Rum, which would have corresponded roughly to the wilderness wanderings of the Israelites, has many deposits of flint. For example, here's one in the Archaeological Survey published in the American Journal of Archaeology in 2012, just a few years ago. And you can see the lunate fracture, the conchoidal fracture of flint, because it's microcrystalline silicate. In other words, everybody knows when you break glass, you have those little lunate, little edges, conchoidal fractures on them, because technically this is glass. Flint is silica, SiO2, with some chemical things added to it that make it opaque. But you can see the conchoidal fractures there, and you get a lot of these little microlith blades. In fact, you can make them easily. Those of us who've done flint knapping or who've used obsidian, you end up getting gouged a lot. You really get cut a lot flint knapping. But in about 15 minutes, you can make well over 100 small microlith blades. Easily, if you know what you're doing. And you don't even have to know what you're doing. You're going to have flying splinters of flint everywhere. But this one, you can see, it's the Wadi. It's not the Wadi Rum, but it's part of this same article. It's part of the Wadi Rum flint complex. So here, this is not my photograph, just to show you. These electron micrographs of the tips of an obsidian blade on the left and a modern steel scalpel on the right illustrate the superiority of the obsidian. It's a glass. Okay? Here's another one. Just this one says, a surgical scalpel on the bottom and an obsidian blade on the top, photographed by a scanning electron microscope at the magnification of 10,000 power. You can kind of ignore, maybe you like the fact that it's BYU. I'd kind of take that off, but I'm not associated with that place or whatever. But this is a good photograph because it shows you that when flint or obsidian splinter, they break in a very acicular way, a clean break that is so sharp, you have to be very careful. This is what the Aztecs used to cut hearts out of living people in the Nahuatl Aztec period in Mexico. And they were so good at it, and the blades were so sharp, they could literally pull a heart out from the chest cavity still pumping. We have descriptions of this, about the acuity of their obsidian blades and chert and flint blades, microcrystalline blades. You see where I'm going with this. Now, this is a fairly new article. You can see up at the top, if you want to look this up. I think it's legible. It's Medical Expo, the magazine, issue 7, Mummies and Surgery, the Story of Ancient Egyptian Obsidian Scalpels, 2015, and so on. But if you want to read this very quickly, these old scalpels, either of flint or obsidian, compare very favorably with modern surgical steel. And you can just see, this is part of the article I excerpted there. Certainly other stones such as flint could have also been used for this purpose. Obsidian is at once smooth and sharp. Blades made of this black, hardened lava are hundreds of times sharper than those made of steel and can make a cut a fraction the thickness of today's scalpels. So, this is what I was discussing at the Sorbonne. And you can imagine, for the few minutes I was talking, that room went dead quiet. And then some people, after I finished, ran up to me and said, "Oh, you've got to publish this, you've got to publish this." But they were so obviously biblical maximalists, I didn't want to get tarred and feathered with that camp. It was very clear but one of them's highly respected, I've mentioned him before, Alan Millard at the University of Liverpool, now emeritus. But I think the point is made, yes? Pun intended. So, when you go back to this passage, it sounds to me like a pretty merciful God, at least as the literary story is suggesting. That if you want to reduce pain, and when you're ripping with bronze or metals, you're really lacerating the flesh, and it takes a lot longer to heal. We know this, that metal blades take a lot longer to heal than volcanic glass or flint. They're clean cuts, they heal better, less infection, and so on. So, what do you think? Is it a Neolithic throwback? Not at all. It was contemporary. And so, I think that while I've never published this, there's plenty of material out there now that anybody could find this out on their own. Now, there are a few questions. I recognize Terrence and then somebody else I don't recognize, but please.
Yeah, I read the book Archaeology review pretty regularly.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things involved in all this really, if we run this together with the golden calf and all the rest, many of these people who left Egypt, right, well, in a Hyksos background,
Mm-hmm.
the nobility of Lower Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
who got none.
Yes.
And the upper classes, the priestly classes in Egypt, they were circumcised, not the whole population.
No.
And it was a status thing in ancient Egypt.
Yes.
And if you run that together, it becomes obvious that there's a little bit more going on than just the Hebrew God.
Sure.
Part
Sure.
of this is the Hyksos being driven out of Egypt.
Yes. Yeah. I'm not sure you all heard part of the question or the comment, but I'm supposed to repeat questions anyway. There's no sign here that says that, but I do recall I'm supposed to repeat questions. Technically, yeah, there's a lot more than meets the eye in the text. There are a lot of practices we know that come out of Egypt. The golden calf, the egel as it is, That's just like the Apis yearling bull that is sacrificed every year in Egypt. I mean, if you're looking for a model, you don't have to look very far if you're in the wilderness. So many other texts. We already know circumcision was practiced in Egypt. Yes, there are a lot of these Hyksos, we can say, overlaps. My point is just to say this is clearly not a Neolithic throwback. You don't have to think of some oral memory recalling what you did thousands of years before. There's no metal. Here's a perfectly appropriate substitute. In fact, better than metal. And you can make these blades very quickly. And you don't need big blades to circumcise. A very small blade will do. Mind you, I wouldn't want to be circumcised, beyond whatever age I was circumcised as a baby. I can just imagine how painful that is as an adolescent. No wonder they had to stop for a while and take time to heal. But they would have healed much slower with bronze or whatever else. Another question, yes?
It may be an obvious question, but was it one blade Israelite?
Interesting. She asked if it was one blade per Israelite. Well, however many thousands it is, as I said, you can make these so quickly. Now, maybe it's not very sanitary when you read the book of Leviticus, which is a commentary on Exodus. Chapter 17 is a litany of really good medical practices, including quarantine, sanitation, isolation, burning infected material, solar light exposure, washing with water 7 times. So we're not talking about a people who don't understand sanitation, especially coming out of septic Egypt. But yeah, I think you could probably just turn the blade one side to the other. You could use a microlith. We're not talking about a big piece of flint or obsidian. A very small piece will do. And obsidian and flint were traded so much in the ancient world that we do see this going back for a long time. The difference is why you go to metal, why you leave stone behind in the first place, is working with stone tools to create them. It's a reductive process. You have to take away. Whereas when you make metal, you're pouring into a mold and you create the shape you want once it cools. So it's an additive process, and you can do a lot with metal that you can't do with stone. By the way, the stone is brittle. Flint and obsidian are brittle. They're, as I said, they're very sharp, but they're brittle. And it's not really the hardness of the material, although this is, believe me, obsidian and flint are hard stone. They're amongst the hardest stones we have. On a Mohs scale of hardness, to be about 7, which is exponentially a lot harder than even steel. Did you know that? Steel is only 6.5. So that's technically it's not a scale. It's not a direct scale. It's an incredibly increasing scale of hardness when you get to flint. The best steel we have today is about 6.5. All right, we must move on, but a few comments or questions.
Have you in any of the digs found flint knives?
Yes. Yeah, there are flint microlith blades all over Jordan. Thousands upon thousands of them. Yes, there are a lot of Bronze Age, Iron Age transitional sites. I've never heard anybody finding a hill of foreskins, though. But yeah, there are appropriate. She asked if we'd found any material that corresponds in time and place to this. Yes, plenty of evidence for flint. It's all over Jordan and all over that area. It's a significantly high proportion of silicate rocks when you find flint. Yes. Flint and obsidian. And you saw, maybe you could see on that map, that satellite image, that you have a lot of volcanic material around there. Here in California, the Native Americans, the Wapo had a lot of obsidian, Annandale and Napa obsidian. I've found it when I've walked through vineyards all through Napa Valley. It's a very important trade item in different societies, including Native Americans. We find it shipped for thousands of miles. It was so valuable. Across the Aegean Sea. Melian obsidian, Anatolian obsidian, these are very important products. All right, I think there was maybe one other question. Dr. Dito, yes.
You're aware then that in electron microscopy, they're Neolithic, what they use for a knife when they're cutting a specimen?
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right. That's right. It's broken glass. Absolutely. For making sections, for sectioning and tomography, yes, that's exactly right. You use glass. You break small shards of glass, and that's what this is. That's what obsidian is. All right. Are we happy with this now? Any other comments or questions? I think I want to move on now to the Philistines. Okay. Now, here we have a picture from the Judean hills. I took this in 1984, and this was when, after, remember, if you had been standing in this place about 1960, it would look like a desert. And what Israel did, Israel, and my slides are somewhat a little bit out of order today. I'm not exactly sure why, but when you look at the photographs of the 1950s and 60s in Israel, there aren't a lot of trees. And what Israel did was it looked around and found a specific type of pine that grew in arid contexts. And 6 million of these were planted over 15 years. Now, the rainfall in this area used to be maximum about 11 inches a year. It's semi-arid. But what the Israel Department of Geography published in their great atlas is rainfall increased from 1960 to 1980. It almost trebled. Now, it wasn't a climatic shift. What they did was they cooled the hills down. When you have winds, remember the Mediterranean basin, which you can't see easily in this picture, but it's right there. There's the Mediterranean out there. These are the top of the hills, and they go increasingly flatter and flatter to the sea, which you can't glimpse, but it's out there. And the Mediterranean basin is an evaporitic basin. More water evaporates out than flows in. You probably knew that, yes? More water evaporates out than flows in. But these moisture-laden winds, they're coming from the west. They bring this evaporitic moisture, and the winds come along the flatlands, rise, and they hit this point, and they're cooled extensively. The trees defenestrate the heat. If you stand under a tree here, it's probably 20 degrees cooler than if you're standing in the sun. We know that from experience, yes? Sometimes we want to be standing in the sun. But in this case, in this hot area, the air is cooled so quickly, what happens is it reaches dew point. It condenses. And so that's why Israel trebled its rainfall in a few decades. You can see if you want to read the climatic data. So they planted millions of these trees, and that's where I'm standing. And it's, I experimented with this. This picture is taken in January of 1984, and I probably preferred to stand in the sun on that day because it was really cold under those trees. But you're looking from this picture, right down here is the Sorek River Valley. In the Sorek River Valley, there was a town here called Timnah, Timnah, which was the border, kind of no man's land between the Philistines, who lived on the coast, and the Israelites who lived in the hills. Particularly, this where I'm standing is the tribe of Judah. But down there, it's the tribe of Dan, and you get down to here, and it's the Philistines. The territory was well demarcated, although the Philistines were encroaching. And if you read the book of Judges, and you read the story of Samson, an imperfect judge, a shofet, was raised up to deal with the Philistines, and not easily. He didn't deal with them kindly. Whacked them with jawbones, burned their wheat fields, slew them all in all kinds of ways. But Samson was the sort of dirty stick used at that time, because the Philistines not only were encroaching up to here, they were coming up and moving gradually up into the Shephelah, the intermediate hill zone. But they were also moving all the way up the coast to the area of the Megiddo Gap, and they'd come over Mount Carmel, and they were filling up the Esdraelon Valley. So they were increasing, and this was a real threat to Israel at the time. Now, it's interesting when you consider this word Philistine. We all know the word Philistine has sort of a derogatory connotation of being uncultured, unappreciative of art, and so on. And a lot of things we could say about the Philistines, but it's the way that they are looked at by others. Now, technically, that's not really very fair, because in some ways they may have been equally cultured as the Israelites above them in the hills. Now, this is a text out of a prophet. I thought it was Isaiah, but now I'm not so sure. But anyway, he says, "Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt and the Philistines from Kaphtor?" Kaphtor, if we identify Kaphtor in antiquity, it's essentially the island of Cyprus. And Keftiu is the Egyptian word for the island of Crete. And what happens is we know that somewhere in the 12th century BCE, cataclysmic things happened around the world. There was an ensuing what we call Dark Ages for about 400 years. Not everywhere, but all throughout this part of the world. Great cities fell: Troy, Mycenae, Tiryns, and so on. Pylos. Great cities went down in flames. And there was a climatic perturbation. We know this is what ended the late Bronze Age. It became really difficult to exist, and kings couldn't keep their societies intact. And there was a problem. You had periodic drought that lasted 2 or 3 years. Now let's think through this. In the ancient world, when they had drought, they couldn't just call up refrigerated fruit from New Zealand or Chile. What'd they do? Let's think about this. If you have 100 bushels of wheat that you plant, and you expect to keep out 1/10 of that for seed, you eat 90 bushels and you keep out 10 bushels for seed for the next year. So in a normal year, you have 100 bushels of product, and that everything's good and rosy. But let's say the next year you have a drought. And let's say you planted 10 bushels out of the 100 and for seed, but instead of getting 100 bushels, you only got 70. So you were down by almost a third of your food, but you had the same number of mouths to feed. Well, you tighten the belt a little bit, but you have to make a decision. How much do you plant? Do you plant 10 bushels again, which eats in now to your diminished food supply, or do you put in the standard 10%, which is now 7 bushels? Well, let's say that you decide to eat okay, next year's going to be better, and you only plant 7 bushels. But let's say a second year of drought comes, and now you only get 50 bushels. It was worse. You see where this is going. You have the same number of mouths to feed, and now you have half the food. And you have to also feed your animals. Essentially what happens is malnutrition is followed by disease, is followed by civil war and strife, is followed by death. Societies fall apart. This is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That's exactly what Revelation 6 says, but not quite as clear as I've just put it. You know, it's apocalyptic literature. It's allegorical and metaphorical too. But 3 years of climate problems in the ancient world. That could be flood instead of drought. But irregularities brought civilizations to their knees. And one of the things that happened was mass migration. Now, you can check out this in many other different ways. You don't have to believe me on this. But we now know that a substantial portion of the Aegean world, after Pylos and Gla and Thebes and Tiryns and Mycenae and all the other fortresses, they emptied out. Troy, too. So all these places, Philokopi, many of these sites, people just left. The kings couldn't provide security. The kings couldn't provide food. The society couldn't provide hierarchical order. Civil war, strife, mayhem. And so a lot of people just started moving. And we see part of the migration going to Crete. We see part of the migration going to Cyprus. Apparently it wasn't so bad over here. And so what we have a move, and it is called huge ships in the 12th century. Huge fleets of ships start landing along the coast of Egypt. Ramses III depicts how he pushed them away, how he fought them at his temple at Medinet Habu. And so they're called the Sea Peoples, or the peoples of the sea. And this is fully accepted now across every area of scholarship that I know. Now, the word for the sea peoples, the peoples of the sea, it's dividing them up into different tribal groups. The Shardanu, the Jarrett, but one of the ones that's prominent is called the Peluset. And they're depicted very well on these reliefs at Medinet Habu in Egypt. So the word Peluset is the Egyptian word. It's translated into Hebrew as Peluzdim. And that, when the Greek Septuagint is translated for the Ptolemies who are living in Alexandria, by order of the Ptolemy, it becomes Philistines. And that same word is the word that gives us the modern word Palestine. Now, let me tell you, the people who call themselves Palestinian today are not related. A very, very different DNA profile. Those people came in relatively following the Hijra of Muhammad. They are not the Philistines. Okay? You can do the DNA tests. You can look this literature up. And in fact, I don't even want to go into detail, but I have a real problem with that, even that word Palestinian. Okay, so anyway, now what we know about them is that their culture, their cultural style, their architecture, their ceramics, their language, how they live, they're mostly wheat farmers. They are people who very much look Aegean. That's their source. And I'm not the only one saying this. But I don't have a blackboard to draw this up for you, but you can see, remember, in antiquity, vowels you can shift around and you can make them longer or shorter. But you see, in each of these words, the initial bilabial unvoiced stop P, then you see an L, then you see an S, and then you see either a D or T, because D and T are basically minimal pairs. The D is voiced, the T is unvoiced. Remember, we've done this before. But if you make that sound in your mouth, make a T, and then now add your vocal cords to it. Dead, 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 dead. So they're minimal pairs phonologically. So it's really the same word. Now, what about the culture? How can we determine that they were actually Aegean, Hellenic or pre-Hellenic, Greek-like peoples? Here's my photo taken from Ashkelon. I'm basically right on the coast here. This is the coastal highway going up Israel. And by the way, that's a Philistine city initially. That's actually, we have a word that appears to be Philistine. And you can see the coastal plain. And then, in the midground, that's the Shephelah. Those are the beginning hills. Do you see them? And then way back there, you see the Judean mountains. So that picture I originally showed you from the forest looking down would be about right here, near what was the city of Bet Horon. So now I'm looking east instead of looking west, as I did in the previous picture. This is the flatland, And this is where the Peluset, when they were repelled by Ramses III, this is where they settled. It's very clear. And this is what Trudy and Moshe Dotan say. This is what also N.K. Sanders, S-A-N-D-A-R, said in her book, The Sea Peoples. It's also what Eric Klein says in his new book that you may have read, 1177 BC. I'll talk about some of these books. But everybody now in archaeology and history accepts that the Peluset become the Philistines. These sea peoples who came from the Aegean were repelled by the Egyptians and then moved slightly to the northeast, up the coast, and settled here. And basically, what's so interesting is the area they take over, what's called the Pentapolis, the 5 cities of the Philistines, roughly corresponds today, although it's a coincidence and a sad one, to the Gaza Strip. Now, this is one of the reliefs. This is just an artist's relief. This is from Trudy Dotan's book, showing these people arriving in their boats and the sea fights between them and the Egyptians. And then they're repelled. Many of them are captured. And you can see what happens. And we'll do some close-ups of some of this. And you can see this is a pretty decent artistic representation of that. But let's now look at some of the images of the sea peoples. Particularly, I'm going to show you mostly the Peluset and a few Shardanu. Those are some of the reliefs of some of the captives of the sea peoples, particularly the Peluset. And notice they all have this distinctive, we don't know if it's a mohawk or what, but they all have this distinctive headdress. Can you see their captives? Their arms are tied up or over their heads with a thong around their elbows. But very distinctive. Now they're Egyptianized, but they're not Egyptian. Here's some more pictures of them, some close-ups. Is this a headdress? We don't think it's necessarily their hair. But whatever the case, we see this again and again and again in the imagery of the sea peoples. Try to remember that sort of headdress or hair or whatever. Here's some more of them. Close-ups. Now, why many people think of it as a headdress is because sometimes you see what looks like a strap, but other times you don't. So it's ambiguous. Whatever. Now, this is interesting because this is from Enkomi, Cyprus. 12th century, early 12th century. So somewhere around between 1190 to 1175 BCE. And it looks the same. And this is on Cyprus. This corresponds to the idea, and this is from Trudy and Moshe Dotan's book, The Peoples of the Sea. It corresponds to the idea that they came via the islands. From the Aegean, island hopping to Crete, to Cyprus, Kaftor, then straight down to Egypt. And notice here's another one. This is a conical stone seal with the same kind of headdress, or close enough. So we see this here and here. This one, a relief on an ivory game box. This one on a conical stone seal. So Peluset, Philistine, eventually. Here's more of that relief. And what I want to point out, if you look at, you see many of these people with that headdress, yes? But not everybody does. Some of them have these spiked helmets. There's more of the same headdresses. But you see this boat right here has these horns on their helmets. So these are Peluset, those are Shardanu. Those are Peluset, those are Shardanu. So Peluset, Peluset, Shardanu, Shardanu. Do you see the difference in the depictions? Now it's interesting because we have both of these representations of the horned helmets and those interesting mohawky headgear. We have both of those found in Crete and the mainland Greece. Let's elaborate a bit. Here's some more of that Medinet Habu relief found at Thebes. You can just see again, the Egyptians depict these people. Even though they Egyptianize, they distinguish them by their headgear, as we saw. Now, here's another example. Some people, Eric Klein, N.K. Sanders, the Dotons, and nobody can argue against them, see these Shardanu as sort of sub-Mycenaeans. Now, Mycenae, you know that city in Greece. I was just there a few weeks ago, just before class started. And I was probing a lot of museums. I brought a few pictures today from my museum visits and site visits. This is apparently some clay stamps. These are examples of clay stamps from Philistine sites, but we don't know what they mean. If you know that Mycenaean Linear B is Proto-Greek, that's good. But Mycenaean Linear A, which precedes it, Minoan Linear A and Cypro-Minoan, we still have not solved linguistically. These are mysteries, how to read them. Now, sometimes we can actually see they've borrowed the Ugaritic and Phoenician alphabet in some of their inscriptions. That, for example, if you look at it, that's exactly what Phoenician looks like at the time. Now this, I'm sorry, this is a bit of a fuzzy label. This is from, again, Trudy Doton's book, Inscription Found at Tel Mikne, which records the dedication of a temple, confirms the identification of the site Tel Mikne as Ekron, one of the 5 Philistine capital cities. But this is the same if you were looking at early Hebrew or looking at Phoenician. Now they've borrowed this type of writing. Maybe this is not sensible. It doesn't look like cuneiform to me. I don't know what it means. It may not mean a whole lot, but this is clearly meaningful and can be read if you read. And the language is, in fact, a variant of Canaanite now. So they've picked up at this time, by the 11th century, they've picked up literally the alphabet that's used in Israel and also used in Phoenicia. Now this is a Mycenaean vase, and look at the shape. It's a crater. This one's from the British Museum, and this shape, you may have gone up Highway 29 for years and seen a winery that borrowed this image. But anyway, look, it's symbiosis between a bird getting lice off a bull. And look at the bird tracks on the back. But the shape is a crater. This is a Mycenaean shape, and we have a lot of Philistine pottery of the identical shape, and often the same kind of decoration. Do you see the bird here? That bird is a very prevalent Philistine image as well in pottery. Now here is a Mycenaean vase, a crater. You see it's the same shape, and you see the horns on the helmets here. Now, sometimes they're both shown in the front, and sometimes they're shown side by side, one back, one front. But these are horn helmets, and we know that the horns and the helmets are often made from boar tusks. And that's exactly what we also find in Philistia. Now here's some Philistine pottery. You can see, again, I took this just out of photographing Trudy and Moshe Doton's book. This is from Ashdod. And can you see those same type of bird motifs? The pottery, the ceramic style, is pretty identical. And you have a very small, like, crater shape here. Now this is what we call a megaron, a hearth with 4 pillars. 1, 2, 3, and there's a puddle over here. There's a hearth, that's ash, that's at Mycenae. And we also find hearths and 4 pillars like this megaron architecture style at Philistine sites. As I said, pottery, architecture, even linguistic connections. There's a Philistine duck vase. We don't know what it really means, if it's just decorative, but there you have it. Now here, this is from the same book, Philistine pottery equals Mycenaean pottery. There's a stirrup vessel type. There are those same birds. There's the same relief. So this is the side view, top view, and then the frieze here rolled out. So this was found at the, this is a Mycenaean style jar, but it's Philistine. Here's some more. These are Philistine shapes, and there's another crater shape that's identical to what we saw before in Mycenaean sites. So these are very good, these are plates from the books, in particularly Trudy and Moshe Dotan's book on Philistine pottery. And the case they're making is Philistine pottery is Mycenaean pottery from the Aegean. They brought this directly when they migrated. Nobody's arguing against this anymore. In fact, there wasn't a big argument even at the outset when this came out in the 80s and 90s. Now, here's another one showing those same bird motifs with the kind of cross-hatching and sort of geometric style pottery. And now that is from the Heraklion Museum. I just saw that a few weeks ago, but this one came out of a book. The marine style imagery, you have that as well. And that's a photograph I took just a few weeks ago, marine style. But do you see the shape again? Now these are amphora types. That's a crater type. But the pottery, in fact, now we've even found some of the Philistine pottery has been chemically analyzed to find its source, and even some of the Philistine pottery has proven to come from Cyprus. So the stepping stone connections work. Now you might say, well, isn't there trade in pottery? Yes, but there was plenty of clay on the Levantine coast in Philistia too, and they eventually made their own. Now that's this is a picture I took at the National Archaeology Museum, the Ethnikon Museum in Athens a few weeks ago. And the pommel you can't see, the cap, but we have a pommel cap that we'll see shortly from Philistia that's almost identical. Now you can say, well, don't styles diffuse? Yes, styles diffuse. But the similarities are uncanny. Now here, when you go to the Israel Museum, I'll be speaking there next October on a Provenance conference in Jerusalem between Hebrew University and the Israel Museum. We'll see these in a minute, but these are some anthropoid coffin caps, heads, that seem to have some of these similar headdress emblems. Maybe not similar enough, but other people have made a lot of these connections as well, including the German Deutsche Archaeologisches Institut archaeologist Hermann Ranke. They're the same anthropoid coffin heads, and you can see, again, that many people think they have that similar head style that we see on the Medinet Habu reliefs. These are pretty rude. They're not well done. They are not what you'd call very representational, but maybe close enough. Now that's my picture in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And these shapes that you see here, these are Philistine coffins. I guarantee you they're identical what you'll see in the Heraklion Museum in Crete and the British Museum for Minoan and Mycenaean Larnakis. They're identical. So even their coffin shape came directly from Crete and the mainland. If you go to the National Archaeology Museum in Athens, or if you go to the Heraklion Museum in Crete, hundreds of miles from Israel, these are found in Israel from Philistine sites, they're identical. And they only appear in the Greek contexts and Philistine contexts. It's a one-to-one, what we call material culture typological parallel. Pretty hard to explain because it doesn't appear, in this case, in between. It doesn't appear to have diffused as a cultural prototype across many cultures. It just is found in Greece and in Israel. And it's, I think, one of the strongest evidences, again, for this. And some of those head shapes, those ones that I showed you, the coffin heads are found in places like this. Now, we'll just stop for a minute because I don't often give enough time for questions. But I think I see some questions coming. Anybody? Yes?
Genetically, are there a link between the Philistines and what we call the Greeks?
Interestingly, R1b is the dominant DNA haplogroup that seems to be spread, and it went from the Levant west. So they have that mostly. But there are not a lot of Philistine bones found. There's not enough to make a strong identity yet. But what is interesting is the current people. There's enough, just enough DNA studies to show that the current people who call themselves Palestinians are not descended from the Philistines. But I don't know of any study that's shown the direct correlation with Greek other than the R1b shared haplogroup. So it's only a partial answer I have for you. Yes, sir? Oh, okay. He asked if there are earthquakes that are part of this salient. Technically, we don't have earthquake evidence, but we have huge volcanological ash evidence in the air. That at this time, roughly around the 13th century BCE, the late Shang dynasty records show that they were recording a lot of volcanoes to the south of them. Probably the Ring of Fire around Indonesia. Sometimes Chinese records are so explicit they even give the exact year. And how much ash, how they couldn't see the sun. And we do know that a lot of volcanological phenomena are followed by several cold, wet years or years with climatic perturbation. So more volcanology than earthquake. Well, it's a seismic area, so there are always earthquakes. Yeah, but in this case, we don't have any eruptions there, but we have a prior eruption in 1620 BCE that's now very well dated when the island of Thera blew up. And that probably destroyed, Plato suggests that this, well, he doesn't say this correlates with, but people are saying this. My friend Christos Noumos at the University of Athens, who dug the site of Akrotiri, I stayed on the site with him in 1999. He wrote the book called Thera, Pompeii of the Aegean. And now tephra studies show that that volcano destroyed the fleet of the Minoans, destroyed the thalassocracy of the Minoans, and helped bring about the fall of the Minoan Empire, followed by the Mycenaean Empire. So we know that volcano. The tsunami that followed broke up the Minoan ships like matchsticks. I was just at the site of Amnisos in Crete where that fleet was stored and destroyed. This was put forward by Spiridon Marinatus in the 70s. I mean, there's a lot of volcanological evidence that we can cite, but not so much earthquake evidence. Any other questions before we go on? Yes, in the back.
This whole period of so-called Okavan with wandering and
Oh, sorry, there was somebody else, Terrence. There was somebody else in the back. You can come next. Yeah, sir, yeah. The Philistines are, but the Israelites are not. The Israelites have, he asked, do we see connections between pottery, I think if I heard you right. Yes, there's more influence. The question was, is there more Greek influence on the Philistine culture than Israelite? Yes. You see very little penetration culturally of Israelite culture or Canaanite culture or Amorite culture on Philistia. You see far more influence of Hellenic or Helladic or Greek or Mycenaean. Yes. We'll try to pull that. So ceramic, architecture, language, and even lifeways. Yes. Terrence now.
The stories of the sea people. You have in Herodotus references to a mass immigration
Pelasgians. Mm-hmm.
to the area of Tuscany, etc.
Mm-hmm.
You also have the Aeneid of Virgil,
Mm-hmm.
references to Troy,
Mm-hmm.
etc.
Yeah.
Direction. At the same time, you also have the ancient Irish legends
Mm-hmm.
of a massive invasion of Celto-Iberians.
Mm-hmm.
Celts from
Mm-hmm.
Spain coming across the
Yeah.
Cascade to Ireland.
Yeah. So
There was apparently a very strange dig movement.
yes. Yeah. The question he's asking is about migrations in general. Yeah, there is, and linguistic too. Most of the migrations Terence mentioned, the Pelasgians Herodotus mentions, coming from Anatolia, relatively speaking, the Trojans in the Aeneid, etc. Many of these are going from east to west. This one is very different, and it's the one going from northwest to southeast. And Trudy and Moshe Dotan, N.K. Sanders, Eric Klein, they've analyzed all the data, and I think we could make a case for there is always, in periods of chaos, mass migrations of people. We've even had a few in the United States in our few hundred years, sometimes chaotic, sometimes very fast. Think of the gold rush for different reasons. And that's a pretty big movement, a 3,000-mile movement much of the way. But this one is very different. And what the scholars that I respect, and I have never heard any arguments against this, all of them are suggesting that if all the cultural material evidence and the linguistic evidence and just the daily evidence shows that these people who become the Philistines come from the Aegean, it explains certain things. It also explains in their new territorial ambitions why they're in conflict with these people. Now, we don't have, intriguingly, a lot of material evidence for religious conflict yet. We're going to talk about that next week. What we do see, however, is territorial conflict. But the Judeans and many of the Israelites are living in the hills, the high ground, and the Philistines are living on the coast. They're wheat farmers. They have some interesting gods, multiplicity. They're pluralistic or polytheistic. But what's intriguing is they're also trying to intermarry with the Israelites. And that's the story we get in the book of Judges, particularly Judges 13 through 18 with Samson. Their intermarriage, their attempted intermarriage, is creating lots of conflicts. But apparently now they're speaking a common language because they can talk to each other. We know that this landing on the coast of Egypt happens pretty close to the early 12th century. But now the stories about them in the book of 1 Samuel are about 100 years later or more. They're suddenly on the rise in the 11th century BCE. Let's go on, though, and then it's almost time for break. Okay. Then let's take our break now, and we'll come back. All right. Now, speaking about Philistine skeletal material and DNA, here I showed you those Larnakis in the Israel Museum. As I said, they are, if you have a smart device, you want to just quickly look at it on your smart device, look up Minoan Larnake, or Larnake. It's spelled here, Larnake. Look it up on your smart device if you want, and you'll see that there's so much overlap. But these and these are where we do have some DNA skeletal material. And that's where we can show that the current Palestinian population is not the least bit Philistine, and where we can also see that what does seem to show some correlation to the Greek. Now, I didn't have a scale in this picture in 1984, so do you see what I used for scale? My blue comb. Do you see it down on the forefront? That's what you do because you always want scale. But what happens with some of these, the smaller, shorter ones in front, the bones have been, after burial, they've been exhumed, disarticulated, and just all put in there in a jumble. And but we do have, and these are these ones that I showed you that also show at times sometimes Egyptian influence, like here, the Hathor wig. But this is one, you can't see it, but it has that spiky headdress here. It just doesn't show well. But now I want to bring up some linguistic evidence as well. The Philistine word for their ruler or their kings, it's the word tsaren. And linguists have looked at this and said, looks a lot like the Greek word tyrannos. The only difference is the T's. You have a range of T's. And this one is a sibilated T, ts, like the word tsitsi, like in tsitsi fly, which you have in African languages. But this word tsaren is still a T. It's T with a small sibilated particle to it. So it's hard to pronounce. But anyway, their word for king is very similar to the Greek word for ruler. I just took this picture in the Heraklion Museum a few weeks ago. It's the Phaistos disc in Crete, and it's still a linguistic mystery. We don't know. It came from the site, the Minoan Palace site of Phaistos, but what I want to point out on it is look at the headdresses. You see them? So this is one of the things that, and this is from Crete. And this is what we call basically late Middle Bronze Age, somewhere around 1600 BCE. But we don't know exactly because when this was found, there's still some mystery about its exact context. We don't know the exact datable context where it's found. It could be slightly later. That can happen. Things do get mixed. But the point I'm making is, do you see how similar the head shapes with the headgear or whatever it is are to the Medinet Habu, Ramses III sea people's headdresses? It's very similar. Now, similarity you can't guarantee is a connection. It could be coincidence, but again, most people don't think it is. Now, here's a basic chronology showing late Bronze Age, and then this is the wave of the Philistines and the Sea Peoples. Somewhere this wave of destruction is coming right around what we call the end. This is the end of the Bronze Age. And from here on, it's the transitional period into the early Iron Age. And then we have the Sea Peoples become the Philistines here. And roughly in this year, between 1200 and 1100, this is the same period where it says general wave of destruction and the Levant and the Aegean. Hence you have Eric Klein's book, 1177 BC, which I'd highly recommend you to read. Now, and then you have this ensuing Dark Ages. Big gap here. But you don't have a big gap. You don't have a big gap in Israel and Palestine. This is the period of the Judges right here. So from right here, somewhere here to here is the period of the Judges. And remember, I never get tired of sort of talking about this, one of my teachers at the American Institute in Jerusalem really made this very clear to us, that you have Mesopotamia up here and Egypt down here, and generally speaking, you have this ebb and flow of who's going to be dominant. And so when Mesopotamia is dominant, you have all these Mesopotamian artifacts in Israel. When Egypt is dominant, you have all these Egyptian artifacts in Israel and Lebanon and Syria. But what's so intriguing is from about this time, literally speaking, from about this time here for this to about a little bit after this, there's a huge vacuum of power. Neither Egypt nor Mesopotamia are strong. They're both weak. And that's when Israel rises. And it's very clear from the historical and material record. No Egyptian or Mesopotamian cultural manifestations dominate Israel at that time. And if you look at their histories, you can see they're both weak. What's happened in Egypt, the Ramesside dynasty ends, and after that, after the 21st, 22nd dynasty in Egypt, it's just a series of very poor, weak rulers. So Egypt is not in an expansionist mode whatsoever, like it was under Thutmose III or Ramses the Great, Ramses II. And the same thing, Mesopotamia is weak. The strongest culture in Mesopotamia at the time is the Kassite, and it barely gets out of Babylon. So there's no, while the normal ebb and flow is going on through history, the Bronze Age, this period, boom, they're both pulling back and not in any kind of expansionist mode. Question, yes? For this, roughly the end of the Bronze Age, about 1100 BCE to about the 10th century, so about 200 years. And what happens then is that Tiglath-Pileser I, the Neo-Assyrian kings, ends that brief respite, and now Mesopotamia becomes dominant, and the Assyrians move east all the way up the Tigris and Euphrates, and they take over Phoenicia. So that's about the end of that little brief window, that 150 to 200 year period of Israelite independence and strength and not paying tribute or taxes or vassalage to anyone. This is a historical given. This is not something that archaeologists make up. You can see it in the material record. Right, but this is also the time period when the Philistines rise. After they've left the Aegean, they have moved into the land on the coast. But they're not strong after about 1050 or so. This is when also the Philistines are dominant right in this period. Question in the back. Yes?
Wasn't there a plague?
There have been lots of plagues.
But a really big plague that really affected Ramses III and the Hittites.
Yeah, the Hittites also, right, the other possible wave of expansion from Anatolia, the Hittites are now done too. And yes, the last Hittite big push is with Muwatilus in 1274. Muwatilus is the one who fought the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 against Ramses the Great. But yeah, the Hittites, the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, there are always plagues doing people in. But I don't know that we can put a specific on one big plague, except to go back to the four horsemen of the apocalypse. When you're in a crunch for nutrition, malnutrition sets in, which weakens the body. And this we see, that weakened immune systems are going to be more subject to biological agencies. So plague disease will follow malnutrition. I think this is a given historically. But yeah, I think if we accept that general sequence works, drought, flood, famine, dearth of food, malnutrition, disease, social chaos, disorder, death, cultural breakdown. So, all right, now, here are some more ceramic evidences. I just took a picture of these that I didn't put up, but these are from the National Archaeology Museum in Athens. These are called Psi and Phi figures, these ceramic types that you see from Mycenae, late Bronze Age Greece. And here's some very similar figurines from the Philistine sort of figure. They're figures, almost the same head shapes and body shapes, but they're also thrones. These also come out of Trudy and Moshe Dotan's book. Now, this is right here. This is an outlier. This is not necessarily a Philistine city, but this is what we call the Pentapolis, the 5 cities of the Philistines. Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Gath, and Ekron. And you might recall that the Goliath stories, Goliath was a Gittite, a Gath, from here. What's interesting is when you read the Psalms, if you know the Tehillim in Hebrew, the first Psalms, 1 through 10, have musical notations on them. And it says to be played on the shagina or shahilot or nehilot, the flute or whatever, tuned to this. And one of them even says tuned to gittith, which looks like somebody copped a Philistine pop 40 song and wrote, Hebrew words over the melody of what was a Philistine song. That's what it sounds like. But this kind of cultural borrowing does happen. You can imagine that feud going on right now, that this rock group Led Zeppelin stole somebody else's riff. Mind you, I recall growing up and hearing people ripping off Bach all the time, and then making millions of dollars off ripping off Bach. So why not? But here, these are the 5 cities, and these are right here, and these are the ones that figure prominently in the judges' stories of Samson as well. So 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel are in the Bible. So Judges, the book of Judges, and 1 and 2 Samuel are the time frame that identify the Philistine culture. And here is a little town, and this is the Elah Valley is right over here. You can't see it. And this is the beginning of the Shephelah. You can't see the Judean hills above it. But remember I showed you that first day that ruin, Kirbet Keyaphah, which is in the Elah Valley, just out of this picture. But this is a little town called Bet Shemesh. And it goes back to the Middle Bronze Age, but it had a certain period of Philistine occupation in the 12th, 11th century, right at this time. And I remember working here and digging up Philistine pottery. Literally, it looked just like Mycenaean pottery. I used to hand it out to my pottery workshops at Stanford among students. What do you know? All my good potsherds disappear that way. Anyway, this is Beit Shemesh, a town right on the transitional border between Philistia and Israel. And interestingly, the name means house of the sun, Shamash. So there was apparently a solar god worshipped here in the Canaanite Amorite period before the Philistines came. And you may recall, if you read the story of the sons, and if you read 1 Samuel 1 through about 4, you read how Eli and his wicked sons, Hophni and Phinehas, took the Ark of the Covenant into battle against the Philistines and lost it. And the Philistines took it from city to city, through their Pentapolis. They kept trading it off because they got somehow some mysterious tumors from it. And then they gave, as you recall, they tried to make little offerings of mice and other little things. And Beit Shemesh was the border. And when the ox cart in that story was let loose, it went from Beit Shemesh back into Judea. Do you know that story? I'd recommend you read it. That's in 1 Samuel 1 through 5. You can read about this. Now, these are the two books I'd highly recommend to you. I would recommend N.K. Sanders' book, The Sea Peoples, too, but it's really heavily academic. And it's slightly older than these two. N.K. Sanders was at the Institute of Archaeology in London, where I was a grad student. But here's Trudy and Moshe Dotan and their book, Peoples of the Sea. It's a little hard to read the purple there. Can you see it? The Search for the Philistines. Then this is Eric Klein's book, Princeton University Press book, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. It's a very well-written book, and it's right about the time of the Sea Peoples, when the Sea Peoples come into a chaotic Ramses III Egypt. So I've taken a lot of my pictures today from this book. And Trudy Dotan and Seymour Guyton ran the Albright Institute and the Rockefeller Museum Institute in Jerusalem. Now, this is Tel Mikne. This is the excavation of Ekron, the Philistine city. So you recall it's one of the Pentapolis cities. Let me just go back for a moment. On the map, there you can see it. The northernmost Pentapolis. So you can see the excavations going for Ekron, and you can see it has to be dug out of the hill here, and that's the coastal strip, and that's the Mediterranean right there. So it's pretty close to the Mediterranean. And we'll look at some of those site plans in a minute. Here's the sort of strata of Tel Mikne, and right here, this is the Philistine period, right here. And that's going to be roughly in the middle. Because it was and that's Amarna ware from Egypt, and then that's later Punic ware. So this is the period right here, that's the Philistine stratum. And here's a Philistine building from Ekron, and it's showing the hearth right there. And you can see one of the pillars right there, with another pillar over here, and it's slightly, what you're looking at, the balks don't necessarily always correlate to buildings, but this was a Mycenaean magoron, hearth and four pillars like I showed you at Mycenae. So same type of architecture. Now, here you can see different layers of Ekron. This was a shrine in here. A lot of things have been found. Here's another part of some of the details. Now, let's look at sort of evolution of buildings. Fairly simple buildings. A magoron, a Mycenaean magoron, looks just like this, except there's a hearth and four pillars on it. So you have a portico, an antechamber, and a main hall. So the evolution of buildings is very much what you'd expect to see in Greece or the Balkans and then in the Near East. And many people think that Solomon's temple follows that same model. Now here's a Philistine clay vessel with musicians playing, some kind of instruments like flutes. It's a little bit crude. This one is even cruder. So you put milk in there, you put milk in the top, and the milk, when you tilt it, pours out those two holes. Lovely, yes? Very nourishing. It's a fertility jug, right? You have to space your two cups appropriately. Now here's more of Ekron's structures. So it wasn't a poorly built place. And then now, one of the most intriguing things found at Ekron was partly because of the fact that the Philistines had traveled from the north. We know that the Iron Age starts about now, 12th, 11th century transition. people are beginning to get iron technology. And that seems to start in Anatolia with the Hittites. A little earlier, but it's not predominant yet. And so what was found at Tel Mikne is the first iron implements in Israel, coming from Philistine contexts. So the Philistines had iron before the Israelites. We actually see that quite clearly. And here is that knife that you see up here. In a minute, here are some Egyptianized amulets. It's kind of a ring with a relief. There's a baboon. There are also these little mice, which are like the name used for the shape of the tumor ceramic votive gifts at the Philistine Pentapolis when they're struck with these tumors for hosting the Ark of the Covenant. Now, remember I showed you that Mycenaean sword blade with gold pommel and cap? Here's a pommel cap. This one's Philistine made, and it's identical. You see, again, it's Aegean in style. This one from Ashdod. So if you're looking at the cap of a pommel on a sword hilt, they're almost identical. And again, you don't find the same ones outside this connection between Israel and Greece, or Philistia and the Aegean. Now, this is a Philistine pithos jar. Do you see my comb again for scale in the Israel Museum? I can't tell you how many of these you'll find on Minoan and Mycenaean sites. Identical, even the rope-like braid. If I didn't know when I took this picture, I would think I were in the Heraklion Museum. They're identical. And again, you don't find these outside the Aegean or Philistia. These storage jars like that. We even use a Greek word for it, pithos. That's the iron knife found from Ekron. And it's the first iron implement found in Israel. And it dates right to this Ekron period from the essentially 12th, 11th century BCE. And I want to show you an interesting passage. This is from 1 Samuel 13. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. The price, here, how detailed, the price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plow points and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing goads. Now the interesting thing about this is, those metals, all those tools used, those are bronze. The word blacksmith is the word in Hebrew for ironsmith. So you see that there was a dearth of ironsmithing in Israel at the time. And when you read the description of Goliath's armor and Saul's armor is bronze, and Goliath has an advantage with a bit of iron. So again, the text is pretty clear that ironsmithing, a blacksmith, was always a word used for iron. It's not used for any other metal. Now, these are the valley hills. This is what Israel looked like before they replanted all those millions of pine trees. Intriguingly, we look in these limestone terracines. Do you see the terraces? This is where pollen can be found, and palynology shows us that 3,000 years ago, these were well forested. But you may recall some of the stories about Jonathan shouting across the hilltops to the Philistines on the other side, and they could shout and curse at each other and taunt each other and so on. When I took this picture, I could literally shout across the hill to the next hill and be heard easily. But this is the hill country of Ephraim. This is north of Jerusalem considerably, but it's today it's southeast of Carmel and north of Jerusalem. Just a few more pictures. This is now the Esdraelon Valley. And I took this picture from the top of Mount Gilboa. The Philistines had come all the way, you're looking due west to the Mediterranean. This is the Carmel Highlands here. Jezreel would be over here. And this is a fault zone. And there's a scarp right here on the hill. Can you see it? That's the hillside right there. And it falls down quite a few hundred feet down to the valley floor. This is the site where Saul was killed by the Philistines in the text in 1 Samuel 28 and 29. And what happened is the Philistines came all the way up the coast, came up through the Megiddo Gap, which would be over about here, and then took over the Assyrian Valley, and then they went south down towards Beit Shan, down the Jordan River. So they encircled Israel. This was their high point, the cultural climax of Philistia. And that essentially is it on the slides, but I want to stop. I think we've run out of time again, but as I said, the Philistines are not today's Palestinians. But it's interesting, when we look at the story of the Philistines, we see a lot about the material culture, and I've said it enough today, but just to iterate, we can see that their cultural pathways, their architecture, their ceramic types, their metallurgy, their language, everything they seem to have done, even their agricultural style of living as farmers with wheat, differentiates them from the Israelites and the other people in the Levant, and all the evidence points to they came with these migrations of the sea peoples when the Aegean collapsed. So, that's essentially our thesis. But next week we'll talk about the religious conflicts and Baalism. Thank you.